I want to show you one other thing from John Glenn's reentry, and that is a little clip from the onboard movie camera. And as I mentioned, the procedure that Mission Control recommended was to keep the retro rockets attached after he had fired them to slow down and fall out of orbit and begin re-entering the atmosphere. Normally they were supposed to be jettisoned. And you can see in the bottom right illustration, which is from National Geographic, that that's what it may have looked like if you could have been watching as this retropack began to burn up in the heat of reentry, still attached to the heat shield, but doing its job of keeping the heat shield attached. Now, Glenn was well aware that he had a potential problem, and he didn't know whether it had been a faulty instrumentation or whether it was a real problem. And he said later that he was seeing these chunks of flame go by his window, and he was sort of waiting to feel heat building up at his back, because he knew that if the heat shield had in fact separated, that's where the heat would burn through the spacecraft, and that's where he would feel it. He kept waiting for that. The heat never came. He got, sort of a impressive show from those chunks of flaming retro package going past the window. But let's take a look here at the onboard movie footage of Glenn during the reentry. You can see the light outside the spacecraft from the reentry. And Al Shepard is calling him from Mission Control.
Al, did you mark that time when he got back up there?
The other voice is Chris Kraft, the flight director, but
not exactly, no.
Shepard's the one who's trying to make contact with him. Look at that light from reentry. Look at that glow. That's a pretty fierce glow there. And of course, that seemed like a very long time for the people in Mission Control who were waiting for Glenn to come through that reentry blackout. Of course, during the reentry, with all of that glowing gas around the spacecraft, the heat of reentry creates actually a kind of sheath of plasma, glowing ionized gas, which blocks any radio transmissions from coming from the spacecraft to the ground or vice versa. So there is a phenomenon called reentry blackout. And, it's become familiar today, but for Glenn's flight, it was still a pretty new thing to get used to, and it was pretty harrowing. It was, I think, the first real crisis in the United States manned spaceflight program, and everybody was very relieved, and of course Glenn's flight was a tremendous success. And here you see Glenn returning to a hero's welcome ticker tape parade. Sitting next to him is his wife Annie, and next to her is Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who was pretty much in charge of the space effort from the executive branch of government. Obviously, Kennedy set the direction, but Johnson was much more closely involved and remained an ardent supporter of NASA throughout his life. Well, the next orbital flight was to be flown by astronaut Deke Slayton. His full name is Donald K. Slayton, but he was known to everybody as Deke, and was considered one of the best pilots in the original 7. But just a short while, a couple months or so, I think, before the flight, Slayton was grounded by the doctors, who detected that every once in a while his heart would skip a beat. He felt absolutely fine. There were no ill effects as far as he was concerned, but the docs were worried that during high G situations like reentry, that his heart might start fibrillating, and that, of course, can be lethal. And they really felt that they could not recommend that he fly. And so Slayton was grounded. It was a crushing disappointment to the man. And Scott Carpenter, who was not Slayton's backup, but had been John Glenn's backup and had thus racked up an awful lot of time in the Mercury simulator and learning the systems and so forth, he was named to fly the next orbital flight. That mission took place on May 24th of 1962. Carpenter's spacecraft was called Aurora 7 and was a successful flight until Carpenter discovered that he was running low on attitude control fuel. He had inadvertently triggered two different control systems, which were both trying to control the spacecraft and using up fuel at a rather high rate. He tried to line himself up for reentry and was a little bit off in the timing and the attitude of the reentry, and came down, I think it was a couple hundred miles off course, splashed down in the ocean, and had to wait a couple of hours for the recovery ship to reach him, while some very anxious Americans, many very anxious Americans, waited wondering if he had survived. In fact, Walter Cronkite at one point, with great emotion, declared that we may have lost an astronaut. But Carpenter was safe and sound. When the recovery ship came, they found him floating happily in his life raft. They picked him up, they brought him on the carrier, and it was another great success, for the most part, for Project Mercury. Now, the Soviets were not standing still at this point. They continued to up the ante. This time they launched two separate Vostok missions within a day of each other, one carrying Andrei Nikolaev and the other one Pavel Popovich. And this was the first time that simultaneous missions had been launched. And you can see the cover of Life magazine there. It obviously made a big impact on the media. Notice also that the shape and configuration of the Vostok spacecraft was not known in the West, and so all we could do is speculate, and that painting makes it look quite a bit more elaborate and more massive than it actually was. But that went very well. Then finally, or not finally, but another triumph for Mercury on October 3rd, 1962, Wally Schirra goes for 6 orbits. You can see the film on the right. He's shooting pictures through the cabin with a Hasselblad camera. First time anybody took one of those up in space, but Schirra was very adamant that he wanted to take good pictures while he was in space. And the flight was an absolute textbook flight, and splashed down in great shape, and was another great success for Mercury. Well, the final Mercury flight took place in 1963, May 15th and 16th. It was over a day. It was almost a day and a half. And Gordo Cooper was in space for 22 orbits. You can see some of the footage he shot through the window and pictures of Cooper himself. And on the left there you see a TV picture that he transmitted to the ground. He had his own TV camera. And Cooper even overcame a whole slew of malfunctions, including short circuits aboard the spacecraft and problems with his environmental control system. He had to make a manual reentry, but everything worked out in the end. And you can see here on the left his spacecraft descending to the Pacific, and on the right there is Gordon Cooper after the longest U.S. spaceflight to date in fine shape and bringing Mercury to a triumphant conclusion.